Okay, welcome back to 3-Day Weeks. I'm Lloyd. I'm joined by
Kurt.
So we're talking about, I originally called this episode Labor Value as a Concept, and I realized that was very pretentious of me.
Stern, yeah.
What is it really? We're talking about bullshit jobs.
Yep.
We're talking about JOBs. And Kurt was just telling me, and I said, "Save it for air."
Yeah.
like a true radio professional.
I was ranting.
Save it for air.
Absolutely ranting.
He was talking about free time,
Yeah.
about work-life balance. Tell me what you were thinking about.
I think it's everything. It's not only, it's mainly to do with work, yeah. I try and figure out all of my little things, my little quirks, my little hobbies, my relationships, everything around work. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, okay, I've got meetings this day. How do I get to the gym? Okay, I have to do it really late at night now, or
So
really early in the
what you
morning.
started to realize, even from our first discussion, which was that your life uses work as its center of gravity,
Yeah,
and how that's kind of messed up.
it is, yeah.
And how it doesn't have to be that way. 'Cause you were telling me that you would like to change that.
I would, yeah. I still have no idea how to do it. I'm in a pickle every single day, just trying to figure out how I can do it.
And are you one of those people who has very strong, I'll say puritanical or Protestant ethic sort of work equals love kind of belief systems? Were you raised with that?
Yeah, a little bit of both, really. It was.
I think it was interesting that Craig Ferguson wrote his autobiography, and he talked a lot about this. The idea in Scotland, where he grew up, which was that work was the equivalent of love. That you worked so that you could support your family out of love, but then that gets twisted for him into basically a family that is addicted to work.
Yeah.
And then work becomes, in essence, a vice.
Yeah, I agree to that now. Now, in this last sort of 4 or 5 years, I've come to understand that if you don't have money, you're screwed. You really are, especially nowadays where everything is subscription based now. I mean, everything. I remember when I was a kid, well, not even a kid, like 15 years ago, and I was traveling abroad, and I could go and do shit for free. Yeah. Literally so much stuff. And nowadays I'm like, I'm planning like just to go and walk somewhere and thinking, fuck, do I have to pay to get into this area?
It starts to feel like just going through life is a series of taxes.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
At this point, even you want to watch TV, you got to pay for Netflix.
Yeah.
You got to pay your TV tax, basically. Yeah. It starts to feel that way. All your devices are rented or leased.
There's a new tax every single year. Yeah. Everything is paid now. Everything.
Yeah. So that gives you a lot of stress, and to relieve that or to take pressure off yourself, you work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is somewhat unhealthy.
Yeah, because it bogs you down, and actually it kind of severely gets in the way at some point, because then you're like, shit, I need to think about work so much today that I can't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, that's called cognitive overload. Yeah. Right, and that's something that a lot of people experience. They say that people in poverty. Here's an interesting idea for you to think about. People in poverty, people who don't know where their next meal is coming from, they drop 10 points in IQ. Right? If you were worried about where your next meal comes from, you will test out 10 points dumber on an IQ test.
Really?
Yes. Because there's our brain doesn't work like in the movies. It's not like Morgan Freeman going, "You're using 99% of your brain." But the fact is that if you were very poor, that produces a cognitive load. And that cognitive load reduces your bandwidth for other things. Right. So if you were walking around thinking, "Oh, I've got that bill, it's going to be late, you have less room for anything else. Yeah. Less bandwidth less willingness
Understandable.
to think about it, and less ability to think.
Yeah.
And everyone has seen that, the person who has the worst finances oftentimes makes the worst financial decisions.
Yeah.
Right? This is why the poor are often such victims of predatory financing and debt, but also of high fees. Even everything from speeding tickets to late fees at the library,
Right.
To overdraft fees at your bank. A lot
yeah.
of these things come from poverty. Not to say that you just lack money, but that you really lack the emotional energy to care about being fucked all the time.
Yeah.
So you just accept it. And that's a big theme that we're going to come back to. Because what happens when you keep people working and in poverty is you stop them from thinking. And stopping them from thinking and growing their emotional maturity stops them from having ambition and from having a demand for things to be different. And it keeps them consuming, because consumption, and we're going to talk as well about this, consumption substitutes for power in your life, right? You consume, and I don't just mean this in a poetical way. It's a literal substitute for power over your life, is consumption. We'll talk about why that is in a future episode. Today we're going to be talking about labor. Okay, now dig this for a concept. I should put on some red glasses. Dig this for a concept, man. Go ahead, open the.
Okay, I'm just getting a flapjack.
He's opening a flapjack.
I've got some.
I feel like once upon a time in Mexico, you're buying a taco. He's opening a flapjack. Take it out of the wrapper. This is good radio, by the way. Take it out of the wrapper and put it on the table.
Not on the
no, not on the wrapper.
It's being...
Just put it there on the table. There you can see, don't crinkle.
But okay,
there you go. There you go. Put it on your phone. Even your phone is dirtier than the table for sure. Your fingers are dirtier than that table. I wouldn't worry.
True that.
You see, poverty has caused you to make bad table.
You caused me
decisions.
to have a bad.
No. Kurt's not poor. He works too hard.
No, I'm genuinely not poor. But I always think it because as everybody knows, once you start making a bit more money, then you start getting a higher sort of class of thinking, a higher class of life, and then you get into the same position that you were when you had no money.
Right.
Exactly the same.
So
I got more things now, but
consumption can be a way for us to feel free, but it can also eventually become a way for us to be trapped again.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about too. So dig this for a concept, Kurt. Most of human history, 99% of human history, happens before the Industrial Revolution. Think about that. I'm not talking, when I'm talking about history, I don't mean written histories, right? Because I think it's something like 99% of all books have been written since the Industrial Revolution. But 99% of history happened before the Industrial Revolution. How is that possible?
Right. Industrial Revolution, 1760, right?
Ish, yeah.
Exactly 1760.
Oh, okay. So you've got the number.
Yeah.
So
before that, 99% of history is born, is what you're saying.
99% of history had already happened by then. And this is a concept that we're going to talk about. It's the concept of so-called big history, right? Which is actually, when you look at, the birth of a species or a society, you should really look at where it comes from in a much more holistic way. On anatomically modern humans, right, so to speak, evolved somewhere between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago. So, somewhat academic to say which of those is true.
Yeah, right.
The point being, even most of human history, that's 80% of human history. If you say that the first human, quote unquote, was born 50,000 years ago, 80% of human history happened before the agricultural revolution.
Right. Yeah.
80%. And very often, because in the history books that's one page, we're told, well, that's prehistory. That's one thing. When in fact, would it surprise you to learn that in fact, when you look at the complexity of human society, you realize, as you get into it, that 80% of the time it took for us to get from being modern humans to the agricultural revolution was actually full of us learning and evolving and doing things.
Yeah, of course.
What do you think? Yeah, exactly. Why would the Industrial Revolution happen when it did? Why did the Agricultural Revolution happen when it did? We tend to think of these things as they just appear. But why do they appear? What has been going on until then? And very often what we find when we actually look at the evidence is that it was not nothing. It was most definitely something. For example, it was theorized when we had much less understanding of genetics, especially archaeogenetics, the study of archaeological genes, basically, the expression of ancient plants, seeds that we find around human settlements. It was very often posited by archaeologists that humans invented farming around 10,000 years ago, right? So would it surprise you to learn that this is mostly incorrect?
Yes, it would. Yeah.
Right. So when I say the invention of farming, what do you imagine? The invention of farming. What's happening when I say, okay, you've invented farming. Good job. What happened?
Structurally keeping things together. Animals for farming.
So the first farm.
Yeah.
The first farm had a cow.
Yeah.
A chicken.
Yeah. But they didn't use it for sort of like grazing. They just kept it there to eat tomorrow.
Okay. So it was animals.
Yeah.
Right? But farming is not just about animals, is it?
No.
What else is farming about?
Agriculture, right?
Well, what is agriculture? I mean, what do you need in order to do agriculture? You need control of land, hydrology. You need to know where your water's coming from.
I wouldn't have ever thought that they would be thinking about this, though.
Well, they would. If you want to have a farm, if you have the first farm is 10,000 years ago, you have to have all the things that a farm would need to be a farm.
But I assume that they would move to that area for that specific
right,
reason.
but there was no person 10,000 years ago going, hey, you know what? I'm going to make a farm. Well, what do I need to make a farm? No. All the things that go into making a farm had already been invented.
Yeah.
So why would you invent all the things that go into a farm and not have a farm? Right? Well, why does that happen? Well, as it turns out, when you look through history, what you see is that, for example, for tens of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups, and they would live in particular grazing pastures or near grazing pastures for the animals they hunted. And one of the things that started to happen was by living in those same areas year after year after year, they impacted the local ecologies, right? So they started they would say you stop around a particular stream, and you do that year after year because that particular stream has a lot of great fish. Okay, well, over time there might be some animals around. They graze on a particular type of grass. You would know this because you have tens of thousands of years of ancestry explaining all this stuff to you.
Yeah.
So you really actually, compared to people 1,000 years ago, you have a much greater understanding of genetics, a much greater understanding of biology, because you have a very hands-on working knowledge. So you would understand what kind of grass the deer like to graze on. So you might decide, well, there's a wood over here, but actually I'd like to burn that and get more of this grass going because that's going to be good. It's going to bring more deer. Next time we come here with the nice fish, then we'll have the nice deer over here. And so they do that, and then they start to realize, oh, you know, that grass over there is not getting enough water. What if we diverted a little bit of this water that way, and then we get the grass we like with the animals we like, everything kind of the way we want it, right? So it's kind of almost a nesting process, right? Where humans are changing their environment and then learning, building on those changes and changing them further. Like, for example, this might interest you. Where does corn come from? Do you know this?
Where does corn come from?
What is corn? What is corn?
So corn is something that I put in my breakfast sometimes, or my dinner, my lunch. No, it's from the fields, right?
It grows on a stalk.
Yeah.
Do you know where corn originated?
I would assume somewhere very sort of hot or arid, at least.
Central America.
Central America?
Yeah, Central America, the Aztecs, more or less domesticated corn. Sometimes we're showed, images of quote-unquote wild corn, right? Which is called, I'm going to have to edit in the name, but I think it's called Eracanthus. It's this sort of weedy grass, which has little corn kernels, and we're told this is wild corn.
Right.
Let me blow your mind. There is no wild corn. Wild corn doesn't exist. All corn descends from human cultivated corn.
Really?
Yes. So how is that possible?
Holy shit. I genuinely didn't know that.
Yes.
Okay.
So corn, the closest real wild crop that is associated with corn is common Bermuda grass.
Just grass.
Yeah. So go back about 30,000 years, there's a common ancestor between Bermuda grass, essentially Bermuda grass, not exactly Bermuda grass, and corn. How did that happen? So
they must have mixed something, and
so we go through what archaeologists do is they go to settlements by the sides of rivers. They go through the sediment, and they take layers of sediment. They put those layers through these sort of strainers, and they find seeds. Right? And what they found is that those crops, and by the way, it's not just corn, it's millet, it's grain, it's rice, it's everything that we eat. Yes.
Jesus.
They come from essentially varieties of grass. And over time, humans slowly selected out little traits, tiny traits, things you wouldn't even notice, to make corn into what it is. So it started out as grass. Then at some point it developed these tiny little nodules. And humans, for whatever reason, we saw some value in those tiny little nodules. We replanted those.
Yeah.
Or we ate them and they went through our digestion and they regrew.
Sure.
Until we had this thing that had something of value. And over thousands of years, that became corn, to the point where what we grow in what's corn in Kansas is a plant which cannot even seed itself. If you left corn on the stalk and you didn't open it, it would die. It's completely dependent on humans, and it's intentional, so that it can't get out of control.
Right.
But all corn comes from human development. It's completely engineered by us, for us.
That's mad. That's genuinely mad. I mean, somebody listening on the other side now might not even think that. But
and why am I talking about this when I'm talking about 3-day weeks, right? Because I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, for 80% of human history, there was all this great attention to detail and to evolution. These things were happening even though there was no quote-unquote agricultural revolution. People were learning. Generation to generation, they were learning and they were passing on knowledge. And they were spreading that knowledge. And of course many things get lost in that process, or found many times. But the process is not stopping. It's not 50,000 years of nothing and then an agricultural revolution. So now you know that you can't just one day decide to have a farm. Everything from the grasses that you're using, to the hydrology, to the soil, to the location, to the animals, everything has to be adapted. And everything has to be adapted from something into something useful. I can't take the predecessor of a cow, which would be an oryx. I can't take that and go, I want a cow. No. I have to take that oryx and go, okay, I want a new generation of oryx that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I need to do that a couple of thousand times. And then I end up with cows.
Didn't they do that with the milk cows as well, right?
Absolutely.
Specifically the type of milk that it is.
Absolutely. But at no point, at every single step, what I'm trying to say, every single step in that evolution was intentional and served a purpose.
Yeah.
Because you don't breed animals for hundreds of generations with no goal.
Yeah.
Right? You don't do it thinking, oh, in 100 years they'll have milk. No. The milk happens as a product of many decisions. So history is made up of many, many, many small decisions, which turn into big realities. Right? The farm, the agricultural revolution is not so much an event.
But these are all accidents then, or what? Or
Not
they're purposely
only
done?
Oh, no, some are purposely done, some are accidental. So if there's an accident if a seed gets planted that grows a particular sweet type of grass, you might replicate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what you said. It's like, they don't do this to look in the future and think of it.
No, they're doing it for themselves.
They're doing it
in
for
the
themselves.
moment.
Yeah,
in the moment, and that's what history is: people taking care of themselves in the moment.
Yeah.
So when we look at all of history and all the decisions that go into the agricultural revolution, we're not looking at a moment of just bam, agriculture. That's not happening. That's just a point at which we can see that all those things have come together and they have suddenly vastly impacted the life ways of the people who are living. Suddenly it becomes necessary, not only that it is happening, but that everyone is suddenly living on farms.
Yeah.
And now here's an interesting idea. What do you suppose happened to the standard of living for the typical human being, let's say in Europe 10,000 years ago when the agricultural revolution started? What did the agricultural revolution mean for your standard of living?
For your standard of living?
Your Mesolithic man, and your father's generation were hunters. Now you're a farmer.
It's gonna have to be a lot more structured. Time dependent, and maybe based on, I hate to say it, but maybe like 8 hours of work a day.
Well, so one of the things that happens when people start turning to farming is they start to be confined in what's called a resource trap.
Okay.
Right? And a resource trap is basically exactly what it sounds like. If you have a farm and you're a tribe who's used to having about 40 people, all of a sudden you all have this farm, and that farm is producing most of your food.
Yeah.
And it's producing a lot of food, but you're there all the time.
Yeah.
So what's one of the things that can start happening? You can have a lot of kids.
Yeah.
You can have a lot more sex, and a lot more kids get born. And because you're not traveling, more of those children are likely to survive. So you have suddenly a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
So what happens when you have suddenly a bunch of people living on a farm? Your population is suddenly growing very fast. What do you need to do? Expand.
Yeah.
Right? You need to move that farm, over to the next valley, or you need to take up more of the surrounding area. So you learn to plant more grass. Then you learn how to get more efficiency out of the grass, how to grow bigger. And so that starts to happen faster and faster, because the more kids you have, the more need you have for food. The more need you have for food, the faster you're going to grow. So when we see this quote-unquote explosion of agriculture, what we're really seeing is a tipping point where there were these things that people were doing, right? There was no moment when there was the first farm. There was just the moment when suddenly farming had been figured out to the point where you started to have more kids than you could take care of. And when that started to happen, then all of a sudden farming was everywhere in the space of a few hundred years. Literally in the space of, some of the studies of the genes show that that areas went from completely uncultivated to full of deeply cultivated farms in 100 or 200 years. So farming culture really expanded fast. And you can imagine why, right? You know the old wives' tale about the man who is promised one gift from the king, and he asks for a grain of rice. So if you ask for a grain of rice for every square on a chess set, but each square doubles the previous amount.
Right.
By the time you get to the last square, you have more grains of rice than there are particles in the universe. Right? Geometric exponential growth is very powerful. So once agriculture started to get to the point of geometric growth, it took over the entirety of the environments that it was in, and it did so extremely rapidly. Right? So there was this pop moment where all of a sudden everyone was on farms. And what do you think happened to the average lifestyle of the people who go from a bit of hunter-gathering, a bit of farming still? They were even farming before, but it was never so intense. Now farming is getting much more productive. Every single century, every single generation is producing more. So what happens to the people?
I mean, it's hard to say, because at that point, I'm sure it must have got easier and better for the people. Being hunter-gatherers, that seems much more difficult than, cultivating your own sort of farm and on your own crops. So it must have got better for them. But maybe, as I said before, like a little bit longer, but put that in,
So it's completely the opposite.
Yeah, it must be.
No, it's completely the opposite.
Yeah.
So living on farms is much less healthy.
Right.
And much harder work.
Right. Okay.
Right. The problem is, once you are one of many children, and you have a society to protect, you have to put in more work.
Yeah.
You have to produce more. Suddenly, each individual is producing more than what they consume, but they're having to do it in a much different way. Hunters and gatherers, they would hunt and gather a small amount of time. They might do, some estimates say 15 or 20% of their time was spent gathering food. The rest was spent however they spent it. Learning, playing, doing arts. We don't know. Things other than gathering food. When agriculture started to take over, that completely shifted.
But you don't think maybe like the danger factor must have went into the hunt and gathering, right? And isn't that...
So you're saying, wasn't it better to be on a farm because you knew where your next meal was coming from?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. There's a reason that people didn't just abandon their farms.
Sure.
Right? Clearly, there was something about it that was attractive to them. The question of whether it was a matter of, look, I have 5 kids, I have to be on this farm. Or if it was sort of, no, I really prefer this to traveling seasonally and all this stuff. Right. Very hard to say.
Yeah.
But the fact is that that average lifespans decreased.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so lifespans decreased. The height of individuals, it's been measured, decreased.
How so? Why?
Because they were having a different diet. They were eating much more plants. They were much more sedentary.
Oh my God, this is going on to a point. Do you think meat is better? Do you think we should be eating meat? We've got to be, right?
I'm not gonna Jordan B. Peterson and say that we should eat meat and then have our brains melt.
Yeah. Exactly.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying that. And again, this goes back to us talking about not glorifying the past.
Yeah.
I'm not telling you that being a Stone Age hunter-gatherer is a better life for you. What I am saying is that peoples who adopted agriculture lived less healthy lives.
Yeah.
Physically. They were subject to different risks, not the same risks, and I'm not saying more or fewer, but different risks. For example, war, right? When you have a concept of land ownership, then you have a concept of war.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of evidence that tribal groups, pre-agricultural tribal groups, had wars. It's possible. We know that other primates do have conflicts between different tribes.
Yeah.
but we also don't have any evidence that they did. So it's possible they had hunting grounds they needed to defend. These sorts of things probably existed. But we don't have any evidence that that's true. What we do know is that when people started agriculture, that was when the art of warfare became much more intense. That's when genocide started to happen. That's when wars started to occur, because people had the resources to fund a war. When people are living in hunter-gatherer groups of, again, between 40 and 80 people, there's not a lot of resources that you can use to fight a war. It might be what you call a war, but it would be something different. It wouldn't be these huge sieges, and you wouldn't have soldiers and this organizational aspect to it. So living in agriculture exposes you to new kinds of risks. There's also the risk of disease, right? But then there are other advantages. What do you think some of the advantages of living in a agricultural community as opposed to a hunter-gatherer?
Social. They would have had much more sort of better social existences because they're not moving so often, and they would be able to keep materialistic things with them for children, so they would have had a better lifestyle as well.
So maybe education.
Education is obviously not what I would have thought of straight away, because socially
it's an interesting question, because you assume this is true. But again, we don't have any evidence that it actually is.
I mean, I would have thought the hunting gathering sort of thing would be much more educational at that point in time, because they didn't have anything else. They needed to learn these life lessons.
And you're actually giving up some needs that you have. A farmer doesn't need to know about hunting seasons, right? Doesn't need to know. He needs to know maybe about the seasons of drought and rain. That's when you start to get evidence of really detailed understanding of astronomy and ecology, these kind of systemic knowledge. But you start to lose a lot of the detailed knowledge that people had of the world around them, because they were focusing on agriculture, which is about production. Right, so then it became about producing more, and producing more is more of a process of trial and error as opposed to learning, right? So it's a different kind of knowledge, but there are other advantages to living in agricultural communities. One of them is technology. Suddenly, when you create a new piece of technology, your whole society can benefit from it quite quickly. It doesn't take a long time for that information to spread. And we can see at the beginning of agricultural movements that when one society figured out how to do something, it spread to the others almost instantly. If you look at the agricultural record, you can see that technology like tin, like copper, I'm thinking of bronze, basically, bronze tools. In the archaeological record, I mean, we know that they weren't invented at exactly the same moment. But in the archaeological record, it's essentially instantaneous.
Plows, things like this.
And you see these things appear from Turkey, the Middle East, all the way to Britain, and they appear at almost exactly the same moment. Because they're so valuable that they transcend cultures, that they travel vast distances, and within a few hundred years, everyone is doing the same thing. So, and actually that gets to the sort of Mesolithic world system. For the first time in that period, the early the early agrarian period was when there started to be an international system of trade. And the reason was that the discovery of how to make bronze using tin, and tin had to be transported. So it was a limited resource. I don't remember exactly how the process goes, but you need basically arsenic to remove the zinc or to add the zinc to copper, basically. So you could use that to make bronze, or you could use tin, and this world system was based on trading these valuables: copper, zinc, arsenic, tin, and those were the first sort of international trade systems. And we're talking 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, and already goods were traveling all the way from the Middle East to Western Europe and into Asia because of that system, because it was so advantageous to farming. So now already we have this concept of work, right? So that's a bit of the history of work up until essentially the beginning of feudalism, right? Now, Kurt's giving me the hairy eyeball,
just say it how it is. What the fuck? What is that?
So what is feudalism?
Yeah.
What is feudalism? Do you know?
Sounds like futile.
Feudalism. So you know what serfdom is. You remember from something in high school about serfdom and feudal lords. You know,
absolutely not.
Not you know the concept of dukes and duchesses and princes and earls and okay, so on and so on. All those traditions come from the concept of feudalism, right? So feudalism is basically it's the concept of taking an agricultural region and putting one person kind of in charge of the politics of that region.
Right.
Call that person a prince or a king or a duchy or whatever. And then everyone who lives on that land has to pay the piper, basically, has to pay taxes to that person. And he becomes the feudal lord.
Right, okay.
Right? So this was the beginning, and now we're talking about, I'm skipping, by the way, anyone who's having an aneurysm about my interpretations of history, I'm skipping a lot of steps. But I'm getting up to, let's say, closer to the modern period.
Right.
By the time the agricultural revolution, by the time the Industrial Revolution happened, we had gone through a process of transforming the nature of work. And that starts with the feudal period.
Right.
So in the feudal period, you have lords, essentially feudal fiefs they're called, who may have some loyalty to a higher king like a Caesar or a pharaoh, but in general they rule their own agricultural region. And in that region they have serfs, and the serfs are somewhat like slaves, although it's a different type of relationship, sort of like tenant farmers, who work the same land generation after generation. And there's a tradition of loyalty to the lord, right? And that loyalty is paid for through essentially taxation. A portion of your production is given to the lord, right? And that's the setting in which the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment started to change the world from a land theory of value to a resource theory of value. So in a feudal system, stop me if you're lost anywhere. In a feudal system, the main thing is the land is valuable. It doesn't matter as much how many serfs you have, although having more is better usually than having fewer. Still, you have to feed all of those serfs.
Right.
If you're a feudal lord, imagine, your best resource, the thing that you like the most is the land. Because the land, the better the land you have, the richer you are. You can have a few serfs working hard, or you can have a lot of serfs working less hard, but your land is going to determine your riches. So having more land is better. Obviously, and having richer land is better, right? So that was sort of the pecking order. What happens in the Enlightenment, this gets into a lot of different topics like financialization and changes in trade and mercantilism, all this stuff. But essentially, the European nations discover colonization. And suddenly these feudal fiefdoms become a source of wealth, which can be collateralized, risked, essentially, on colonizing, right? So now suddenly a feudal lord can take all that income and invest it in something. So imagine under feudalism for hundreds of years, a lord had a pretty steady income, but also nothing to really invest in. You would have to take some of that money for yourself, buy certain things, upkeep your castle, whatever it is, but you'd have to spend a lot of that money back on the peasants. Right? What started to happen at the beginning of the Enlightenment was that feudal lords figured out they could take their wealth in the form of their land. They could mortgage it, meaning borrow money or tax, and then they could invest that money in adventures overseas, in going into the New World or going to get spices in Asia. And when the money came back, when the trade mission came back, they would suddenly be 3 times wealthier, 4 times wealthier, all at once. And then you have Lloyd's of London, and you have trade companies, and you have huge expansion in the complexity of society. But it starts with those feudal lords having that cash and nothing to do with it, right? And what happens at the same time? The serfs are looking at those landlords, and they're saying, "Hang on, you're taking my income, you're putting it on some trade mission to go to Asia. You're making 10 times." 100 times. One of the first Portuguese trade missions to the Indian subcontinent went all the way around the Horn of Africa. The investors in that trade mission made 700 to 1 returns on their investments. Right? So the beginning of colonization, I realize now I just kind of skipped to colonization from the agricultural revolution.
There was a bit of a step.
The beginning of colonization introduced essentially the beginning of income inequality. Because in a feudal system, this is the reason the feudal system stuck around for hundreds and hundreds of years. In some respects, thousands of years, because it's very stable. Right? The amount of work that is required to work the land stays more or less the same. The amount that it takes to run the castle stays more or less the same. Everything is predictable. If you suddenly are taking your wealth and gambling it on big international trade stuff, you suddenly have a lot more wealth. And then you have a lot more people who are very jealous of that wealth. And maybe some of the serfs don't want to be serfs anymore. They don't want to work on the land. They want to go on the colony. Then they want to, participate in the riches, right? So then you have the Enlightenment, the first sort of freeing of labor from land. And that was when, in most parts of Europe, and with the exception of especially Germany, the feudal period ended, and the land theory of value started to die. And that brings us to the Industrial Revolution and colonialism. Are you following me so far?
I am, yeah.
Do you have some questions? So essentially from the beginning of agrarianism, and I'm doing a huge smear here, from the beginning of agrarianism to about 1400, most people, most of the time, in most places in the world, were farmers. That's an easy way to understand it. Well, you're a bit lost.
No, I was a little bit, yeah.
You were probably wondering, what does this have to do with what we're talking about, 3-day weeks?
I mean, yeah, you've got the structure, I don't, so...
Well, I kind of do. And kind of I'm just bloviating. You got to stop me if I'm not being clear.
No, you're being absolutely clear. But yeah, I didn't know where we're going with it.
Right, so this is the point. For hundreds of years, thousands of years, from the time that farming was invented until the time that the Enlightenment happens, that colonialization start to happen, and I'm putting those concepts together, and we'll unwrap them. Most people, most places, most of the time were farmers, and that started to change. And when it started to change, the concept of labor at work having a value started to emerge.
Right.
So then that's where we get to wages, right? So essentially, before that time, of course, wages existed. I mean, you can see reference to paid workers in the Bible.
Yeah.
Right. There was always wages, and in certain pockets of history, at certain times, the the Roman Republic was financialized,
Yeah.
had mercantilism to some degree, had even...
Pharaohs, I mean, they even said that the slaves were not slaves in the end.
Well, of course, but also I would say there were financialized systems where people had hourly wages that they were being paid. These things existed.
Yeah.
But for most people in most circumstances, most of the time you farmed, and you farmed for somebody.
Yeah, yeah.
And with the exceptions of places like Rome, Greece at certain periods,
Yeah.
you would farm for a lord,
Yeah.
and they would be the vassal of some great king or emperor.
Yeah, yeah.
And about the time that Europe figures out that, I'm not saying Europe discovers America, because that never happens. About the time that all of Europe figures out there's another continent
Yeah.
across the Atlantic, is around about the same time that the serfs start leaving the farms.
Okay.
Suddenly, at the same time, and not coincidentally, there's a lot more food. And because there's a lot more food, there's a lot more need for children. There's a lot more, I should say, there's a lot more children. And with those children, there's a need for things to do.
Yeah.
You have the growth of big armies for the first time. Prussia, Russia, France. You start to have the emergence of these big nation states again. And you know, that had been something that was mostly repressed since the fall of the Roman Empire. So you start to have this spectrum of people in society, from working class to middle class to upper class. And in that sort of feathering out of society, you have an emerging concept that labor, that the time someone gives you for agreed work is of a certain value.
Yeah.
And that this should be the way that we should denote value in common currency. And the idea that a person should receive a particular wage for a day's work. And that leads to the inevitable conclusion that if you deserve an income, and that income should buy you a living, that living, that subsistence level should be tied to the wage, right? So you should buy all your food. You should buy your own clothes.
Yeah.
You should engage essentially in commerce to get the things you want. And the person who employs you pays you for that. That's kind of a new concept in 1400. It's not new. It's happened before, but now it's really becoming its own thing. So this is where we're going to stop with the history of where does work come from.
Right.
And we're going to call that good enough. It's way more complicated than what I said.
Right, I'm sure.
And we'll go back and touch on many of those topics. But basically, when we're talking about the beginning of human history up to colonialism, the idea of the wage is the idea of allowing people to choose what work they're going to do in society, and giving them compensation for that work in a standard coin. So that's wages.
Yeah.
And that's where we'll stop this time.